Good evening, dear students. Welcome to Bajirao IAS Academy. UPSC Mains 2024 Gender Studies Paper 1 Analysis. Right. So from past few sessions we have been discussing and also analyzing the nature of previous year questions, particularly UPSC Mains 2024 Gender Studies Paper 1. So by discussing and analyzing the previous year questions, you would get important insights into how UPSC has been asking questions regularly and how UPSC has been linking these questions with the regular current affairs which have been taking place in India and around the world. Right, so that's why the previous year questions analysis is very important, and we have few questions left in gender studies paper 1, so we'll discuss those two questions and then we'll proceed on to discuss gender studies paper 2. We also understand now what are the questions that UPSC has asked from the syllabus of gender studies paper 2. Now if you look at the syllabus of gender studies paper 2, it consists of Indian Constitution, polity, social justice, governance and international relations. So these are the basic areas from which UPSC asks questions from gender studies paper 2. Right, so first we'll start discussing those two questions, remaining questions in gender studies paper 1. So the first question is, despite comprehensive policies for equity and social justice, underprivileged sections are not yet getting the full benefits of affirmative action, which is envisaged by the Indian Constitution. Right, first and foremost we'll try to deconstruct this answer, and when we deconstruct the answer you would understand the essence of this question, and that's how you could answer, you would give a best possible answer for this question. So first and foremost, I hope all of you have a basic understanding about the underprivileged sections of the society or underprivileged sections. Right, so who are these underprivileged sections? Right, so we have scheduled castes, scheduled tribes and persons with disabilities. So those sections in India are known as the underprivileged sections. Right, so the government has launched a number of policies, right, government policies or government initiatives. Now the government policies and initiatives are aimed to address or correct the historical injustices and socio-economic deprivation that the persons with or the underprivileged sections have been facing. Right, for example, reservation policy. So reservations in education and employment, government employment and educational institution has been provided as an affirmative action, and in fact affirmative action is a policy which is aimed to correct the historical injustices of the underprivileged or disadvantaged sections of the Indian society. So reservation policy is an affirmative action policy. So despite there are a lot of government initiatives, despite affirmative action and reservations for the underprivileged sections of the Indian society, so why the underprivileged sections are not getting the full benefits of affirmative action? Why still there are a lot of socio-economic deprivation is being suffered by the scheduled caste, scheduled tribes and persons with the disabilities, and still a lot of people below poverty line are from scheduled caste, scheduled tribes and persons with disabilities? Why education and government employment, their representation is still poor? And that is the question, right? So despite a comprehensive policies from the government side to ensure equity and also social justice for these underprivileged sections of the Indian society, so why these underprivileged sections are not getting the full benefits of affirmative action? The affirmative action includes the government initiatives, and even the reservation policies. And the reservation policy as part of an affirmative action or positive discrimination has been envisaged by the Indian Constitution so that the affirmative action could uplift the weaker or marginalized sections of the Indian society. And so I hope you have understood the essence of this question and in the approach how you could actually structure this answer. So with respect to structuring of this answer, so first and foremost you have to introduce this answer by defining what constitutes affirmative action, what is affirmative action, and then discuss comprehensive policies with equity and social justice. Right, so what are the government policies, what are the government initiatives which aimed at ensuring equity and social justice for the underprivileged sections of the Indian society, and then why these underprivileged sections of the Indian society, despite getting the benefits of the affirmative action or despite there is a policy of affirmative action, why these underprivileged sections are not getting the full benefits of such government policies and such initiatives. So we should look into that, and ultimately we need to conclude the answer by suggesting ways to make these policies more and more effective so that these policies benefits can be fully the policies or initiatives of the government can fully benefit the scheduled caste, scheduled tribes and other marginalized sections of the Indian society. So first and foremost, what you have to do, you need to define affirmative action. Now affirmative action, as I have already told you, that it is a positive discrimination, and affirmative action consists of a set of policies and practices. So the policies and the practices which are part of the affirmative action, and they aimed at promoting equal opportunities for the historically marginalized groups such as racial and ethnic minorities, women, individuals with disabilities, right? So this is known as the affirmative action. Now whenever the question is being asked, you just simply define what constitute affirmative action. So affirmative action is a set of policies and practices, and both policies and the practices which are part of affirmative action, they aimed at promoting equal opportunities for the historically marginalized groups or historically disadvantaged groups. So essentially affirmative action aimed at ensuring equity as well as the social justice, equity and social justice for the historically disadvantaged group of people. And the basic purpose of affirmative action, or what is the basic purpose of affirmative action or having an affirmative action as a policy, is to address the present and past discrimination that these marginalized communities or marginalized groups have been suffering. In fact, the affirmative action aimed at providing preferential treatment, right? So rather additional support. For example, when through the affirmative action government provides reservation for the scheduled caste, scheduled tribes and other backward classes in government jobs and educational institutions, don't you think that it is a part of the preferential treatment of the government to uplift these marginalized sections of the Indian society? Don't you think that it is part of the additional support that the government has been providing to uplift the historically disadvantaged groups? So therefore the affirmative action could be extended in the areas of education, employment and even public contracting. If I can say, when I say about the affirmative action, right, so affirmative action, so with respect to affirmative action, we all knew that the government or Indian Constitution has been providing 15% of the reservation for the scheduled castes, 7.5% of the reservations for the scheduled tribes and even 27% of the reservation for other backward classes based on the recommendations of the Mandal Commission, right? So Mandal Commission has recommended 27% of the reservation for the other backward classes. and even 10% of the reservation for the economically weaker sections within the general category. So therefore these are part of the affirmative action policies to correct the historical injustices that the marginalized sections of the society have been suffering. And then you need to write what are the government policies, what are the government initiatives that were launched to ensure equity and social justice, right? So equity, to make sure that all sections of the Indian society have been getting equal opportunities, fair benefits, and equity essentially deals with the preferential treatment and additional support to these marginalized group of people and ensuring social justice by through the affirmative action policies, right? So we have to understand, we have to discuss what are those policies that the government has launched. So we all knew that we have a comprehensive document which is also known as the living document, which is Indian Constitution. In Indian Constitution itself we have a preamble, and a lot of Supreme Court judgments have interpreted that preamble is part of the Indian Constitution, right? So in fact Keshwanand Bharati judgment has also held that preamble is part of the Indian Constitution, and then the LIC case also Supreme Court has held that preamble is part of the Indian Constitution. I hope you have already gone through the preamble of the Indian Constitution. In the preamble, so you could see that there are terms or principles, ideals like socialist, secular, democratic, republic, and those terms were inserted in the Indian preamble with the same cause of ensuring equity and social justice. The terms socialist, secular, democratic, republic were enshrined or inserted into the Indian preamble with the objective, with the cause of ensuring equity and social justice. And in fact, what does social justice means? Now we have to understand the definition of social justice. It is very important. Now what is social justice? Social justice means that all people are treated fairly without any social distinction, without any discrimination when it comes to the treatment. So that is known as the social justice, and in fact we could say that social justice is the fundamental principle of the Indian Constitution. So Indian Constitution also wanted to ensure equity, equality, and social justice as well. So in order to ensure social justice, in order to treat all sections of the Indian society fairly on equitable terms, Constitution guarantees social justice to the people through the fundamental rights. So we all knew that Indian Constitution part 3 of the Indian Constitution has provided for a list of fundamental rights, and these fundamental rights provide for the political and economic political democracy, not economic democracy. They provided for the political democracy in India, and in fact the list of fundamental rights also strengthen the social justice principle, or also enrich the social justice principle. And in fact when I say an example for the same, Article 15 Clause 1 of the fundamental rights forbids discrimination on the grounds of religion, race, caste, sex, and even place of birth. And apart from Indian preamble, fundamental rights, another very important provision is directive principles of state policy. We all knew that Indian Constitution part 4 of the Indian Constitution have a list of directive principles on state policies, and these directive principles of state policies are aimed at achieving economic as well as social democracy in India, economic and social democracy in India. Now understand the fundamental rights enshrined in the Indian Constitution to ensure political democracy, but on the other hand directive principles of state policy aimed to ensure economic democracy and social democracy in India. So directive principles of state policy, particularly Article 38 of the Indian Constitution, directs state to secure social order for the promotion of welfare of the people. So this is what Article 38 of the Indian Constitution says. And even same directive principles of state policy, Article 41 also entails right to work, education, public assistance in certain cases. So don't you think that all these principles of fundamental rights and directive principles of state policy have come in close conformity with both equity as well as the social justice principles, right? So therefore these are some of the affirmative action policies, initiatives, practices from the government. And in fact the government has also launched a number of legislative legislative measures and number of initiatives as well for the benefit of the marginalized sections of the Indian society. For example, the most important one is being the centrally sponsored scheme for implementation of the Protection of Civil Rights Act 1955, and even then Scheduled Castes and Scheduled Tribes Prevention of Atrocities Act of 1989. So under SC/ST Prevention of Atrocities Act, so there are certain draconian provisions, and it punishes discrimination or abusing or using scheduled caste and scheduled tribe people as a bonded laborers, so etc. is being penalized by Scheduled Caste and Scheduled Tribes Prevention of Atrocities Act. And in fact there are other schemes such as Pradhan Mantri Adarsh Gram Yojana, and even initiatives like support for the marginalized individuals for the livelihood and enterprises, National Safai Karmacharis Finance and Development Corporation, and National Scheduled Caste Finance and Development Corporation. So all these number of initiatives that the government has launched primarily aimed at the development of the marginalized sections of the Indian society. However, even though there are affirmative action policies, government initiatives for the economic empowerment, social empowerment and political empowerment of these marginalized sections of the Indian society, so why the affirmative action policies are not fully benefiting the marginalized sections of the Indian society? So there are certain reasons because of which, despite there are affirmative action policies and government initiatives, those initiatives are not reaching these marginalized sections of the society, right? So we need to discuss challenges of the underprivileged sections. So why these underprivileged sections have not been getting the full benefits of the affirmative action? Now, what are the reasons for the same? So that is what we need to discuss. Now, no doubt that affirmative action has provided for the reservation for scheduled castes, scheduled tribes and other backward classes in educational institutions and the government jobs as well. But the quality of primary and secondary education in marginalized communities is often remains poor. So this was the one reason. Now, we need to have a strong foundation. Any children, when they are going to schools, they need to have a strong foundation. So in later years, their education, their learning outcomes depends on the strong foundation in primary and secondary education levels. However, the reservation is at the higher education, right? So reservation is being provided in educational institutions at higher education, but not primary and secondary education. So children from marginalized communities very often get a poor quality education in primary and secondary education level, and that is one factor where they're not able to completely get the benefits of the policies of affirmative action. And this particular problem has been creating a significant gap in the preparedness of students from these backgrounds, the marginalized children preparing for different exams, either competitive exams or even IIT, JEE, NEET exams or any other exams. So there's a significant gap which has been existing, so they are not able to compete for higher education opportunities, and over a period of time that has been reducing the impact of the affirmative action policies for these marginalized sections. And in fact, even when individuals from scheduled caste and scheduled tribes, so they secure employment opportunities, so they becoming the government employees because a reservation has been provided for the scheduled caste and scheduled tribes, OBCs in government education or government jobs. So through the reservations, or we could also say affirmative action, So they may also face subtle or overt discrimination that limits their advancements and inclusion in the society. So even when they get the employment opportunities, even when they become part of the educational institutions, they are also facing a lot of discrimination in workplaces and even the educational institutions, and that has been limiting their overall potential, and that is why they're not getting the full benefits of the affirmative action. And in fact, marginalized groups in India have also been facing a multiple layers of disadvantages. So those disadvantages include caste, gender, and their location, because most of these marginalized groups are persons who are below poverty line, and they are mostly belong to remote rural areas. Now that would be double burden if a woman who belong to either scheduled caste or scheduled tribe, right? So scheduled caste and scheduled tribe face discrimination, there's no doubt about that, but a woman from scheduled caste and scheduled tribes have been suffering the multiple layers of disadvantage or double burden, right? So that particularly compounding the struggle of these underprivileged individuals in accessing these affirmative action benefits. And in fact, there are a lot of legal safeguards for the scheduled caste, scheduled tribes, and other marginalized group of people. For example, when I say legal safeguard, SC and ST Prevention of Atrocities Act of 1989 has been framed by the government, right? So this would prevent atrocities against scheduled caste and scheduled tribes, and there are a lot of such legal safeguards have been provided for the marginalized individuals. And even the caste-based discrimination is widely prevalent in India. So even after 75 years of India's independence, the caste-based discrimination is highly persists in Indian society, particularly in a rural Indian society, and that is the cause of concern. And even caste-based occupations are still reinforced by people from the upper caste on the people from the lower caste, and that is another major reason that they are not able to fully realize the potential, even though there are affirmative action policies, and all these factors very often leading to the social exclusion of the marginalized communities from economic and the social opportunities, right? So all these are the major challenges because of which the benefits of affirmative action are not fully reached to the marginalized group or marginalized sections of the Indian society. So therefore it is very important the government, the civil society, non-governmental organizations, and even educated and empowered individuals need to work on all these shortcomings to ensure equity and social justice, right? So ultimately we have to achieve the inclusive growth and inclusive development in India. So India could become a developed country only through inclusive growth and inclusive developmental approach. So ultimately, in conclusion, to make social justice and equity are an effective tools for social advancement, it is vital or it is important to guarantee that these policies are implemented correctly and fairly. So these policies of affirmative action implemented in letter and spirit, and it also require a multi-stakeholder collaboration, multi-stakeholder involvement, and that is the essence and that is the need of the hour to achieve social justice and equity in Indian society. So next a question from Gender Studies paper 1 itself. See, remember that globalization is a very important topic, that every year at least one question is being asked from this globalization topic, and even questions are regularly asked on themes like women and even questions on caste system. So they are regularly being asked in Gender Studies paper 1. So therefore you have to be very mindful about these themes. And also remember, Indian society is a very important area from which number of questions are being asked, and this year the weightage from the Indian society has increased significantly or substantially. So therefore you have to focus more and more on the Indian society portion, right? So question is about the globalization. So I hope all of you knew about the term globalization, because from 1970s onwards, globalization as a phenomenon started linking or connecting the entire world. So globalization has become a buzzword and it started connecting the entire world, and globalization is often associated with the terms such as borderless world, right? Borderless world. And globalization is also called as a global village because of its massive interconnectedness of the world, because globalization has blurred the borders of different countries. So it has unified the entire world, it has made the entire world is one single village. So that's how a globalization has gained a lot of momentum in 1970s. So the question is, globalization have increased the urban migration. So generally what happened was, with the globalization as a phenomenon, urban areas have got a lot of investment into those areas, right? So globalization has primarily benefited the service sector. So it has benefited the service sector, and service sector is prominently present in urban areas. And with the rapid growth and development of urban areas, a lot of people from the rural areas have migrated to the urban areas. So globalization has increased migration by the skilled, young and unmarried women from various classes, right? So women have started migrating to these urban areas in search of better living standards and even a gainful employment opportunities. So therefore the question has been saying that the globalization has increased urban migration by skilled, young and married women from various classes, and how has this trend impacted upon their personal freedom and relationship with the family? So this would be the major question. And so first and foremost, we need to understand the approach or the framework, a basic structuring of this answer, and only then we could proceed to discuss this and analyze this. Remember, I have told you that globalization is a very, very important topic that you need to focus on. In the approach of this question, first and foremost, you have to introduce this answer by defining globalization. So what is globalization? You just briefly define that, and then you have to write what are the advantages of the globalization, right? So you have to mention what are the advantages of the globalization, and then you need to discuss how globalization as a phenomenon impact the personal freedom and relationship of women with their respective family. And ultimately you have to conclude the answer by suggesting a way forward. Now remember, structuring of the answer is very, very important. You could write the positive impact of globalization on personal freedom and relationship of women with their family, as well as the negative impact. So that's how you could make this answer a well structured answer, right? Now we'll proceed on to discuss, as I've already told you, that first and foremost you need to define what exactly is globalization. Remember, globalization means it is a process of interaction or integration of the world. Now in fact, as I've already told you, it has enormously increased the interconnectedness of the world. So therefore globalization is a process, is a phenomenon of interaction and interconnectedness and integration among people, companies and governments of different nations. So they come together, or globalization has made all these different stakeholders have come together, and it has increased their integration and their interaction. And globalization is essentially driven by the international trade and investment, and it is primarily aided by the information and communication technology. So information and communication technology is the key factor so which has integrated, which has made interaction so very simple. So one of the significant impacts has been urban migration patterns, particularly among skilled young and unmarried women, right? So this is one of the significant impact so of globalization. And as I've already explained that globalization as a phenomenon has given a rise of urban cities, or urban areas have got an enormous opportunities and enormous investments. So that has led to the significant rise or development of these urban areas. So once these urban areas have been developing, it attracted a lot of skilled young and unmarried women into those urban areas. And in fact, after globalization also, the personal freedoms and relationships of these young women has impacted a lot. So we'll understand both positive and negative impact of the globalization on personal freedoms as well as the relationships of the young woman, a skilled young unmarried woman with their families. So first and foremost, we'll try to briefly understand the advantages of the globalization. What are the basic advantages of the globalization? If you look at the advantages of the globalization, so globalization has led to the rise in gig economy. So gig economy, we could say that a contract based work, so a contract based temporary and short term work, and it has also increased women labor force participation, right? So labor force participation, women female labor force participation rate has increased with the gig based economy and even work from home. And in fact, the gig economy presents a lot of opportunities for the unskilled and even skilled worker in the informal economy. It has substantially increased a female labor force participation rate, and globalization has also led to the a number of companies as unicorns. And in fact, in India also, a lot of startups have emerged as unicorn companies, and in fact a lot of technology driven startups were also started thanks to globalization. And in fact, globalization has promoted equal wages to women, including in the informal sector, because globalization has made because of the globalization, generally what happened, so it has enormously increased free trade and free movement of investments, particularly the foreign direct investments. And it has also helped developing the labor standards as well as the environmental standards of those host countries. So all these factors have substantially helped promoting equal wages for the women, including in the informal sectors as well. And in fact, the social choices of women have also been substantially increased by the phenomenon of globalization. So because what happened, female labor force participation rate has increased enormously. With the increase in the female labor force participation rate, so generally what happened was that women have become financially independent and self-reliant. So financially independent and self-reliant women, so therefore the decision making power has also increased enormously, and therefore that has led to a change in the social choices of women, or the social choices or decision making power of women has increased substantially. And in fact, women are become more and more self-confident, and their morale has also increased a lot, because women are considered as a disadvantaged group. And in fact, women are also highly discriminated, and they were confined to the four walls of the kitchen. So therefore globalization has increased the employment opportunities for the women, and that has led to increased self-confidence and even morale of the people. And in fact, through mass media, for example print media, electronic media, social media, so digital media, through the mass media and even education, so has encouraged rural people to abandon these traditional social and conservative norms and taboos. And it has led to people more and more cultured and civilized. And apart from that, there are certain disadvantages as well, because globalization has promoted westernization, and in fact westernization has emerged as or it has been threatening the local cultures or cultures of the people. Today in India, a lot of languages, particularly the regional languages, are at the cusp of being extinct. A less number of people are speaking the local languages. They're forgetting the local cultures. So globalization has threatened the local cultures of the people. Globalization has destroyed the joint family system in India, and it has led to the emergence of very small families, which are also known as the nuclear families. So there is a significant rise in nuclear families. People are become more and more ambitious, and they are becoming more and more individualistic. So it has impacted the social relations of the people, because more and more people are being addicted to the social media. So all these are certain disadvantages of the globalization. And so the key demand of the question: how globalization impact the personal freedoms and relationship of women with the respective family, right? So in fact, globalization has made no doubt that, because female labor force participation has increased enormously because of the globalization, and when female labor force participation has increased, women became financially independent and self-reliant, right? So they became financially independent and self-reliant as well, and that has made that women they are able to make decisions on their own within the family and on their personal life as well. So that has substantially increased the personal freedom of a woman. And with the increased female labor force participation, women are also able to get the better quality education and even the quality health care as well. So therefore, the personal freedom has increased enormously with the globalization. And in fact, we could say that the families who are back in the rural areas, so most often the families are in the below poverty line, and in fact the families have earned a lot of respect in the society. And when women are working in those urban areas, the families were uplifted from the poverty cycle or chronic cycle of the poverty, and their living standards have improved a lot. The living standards improved, and in fact it has also led to some extent the gender equality and treating women at par with men or boys. So all these things have started. So globalization to some extent has also strengthened the bond of a girl child or woman with the family. These are the positive aspects, but on the other hand there are certain negative aspects also, right? So with the advent of the globalization, there has been a deterioration of the emotional attachment of the woman with the family, because the spread of mobile handsets and internet in rural areas, people are getting detached from their respective social gatherings. And earlier this phenomenon was just confined to the urban areas, but in recent times, because of the government efforts to bridge the digital divide in rural and urban areas, so more and more people have access to mobile phones and internet, and that is over a period of time leading to deterioration in the emotional attachment. And in fact, women work two full-time jobs, because once they have to they work in the offices, so they do full-time work in the offices. Once they come back from the offices, they have to work, they have to look after the family's responsibilities as well, right? So we could say that women work two full-time jobs, and that increases the burden on the woman, and it would lead to a lot of physical, mental, psychological problems and stress that women would face very often. So although some women enjoy the freedom in delaying marriages, because with globalization, with more and more skilled young and unmarried women migrating to rural urban areas, and their personal freedoms have increased. So all these factors have led to a perception that is developed in the society. So delaying delayed marriages for women also, it is okay, right? So women enjoy a lot of freedom in those urban areas, and in fact delayed marriages, they soon realize that this form of independence might actually be a burden, because finding a husband later in life is not easy as their youth stage. So this would be another major concern. So they often felt that they may not be able to find a husband. So once the marriages are being delayed, if they have too much, if they are given too much personal freedom. So culture of imitation in the name of modernization is prevalent because of the globalization, westernization, and in fact there has been a blind race of progress in the age of globalization, where people are started imitating rather than modernizing, like buying a car by selling land, having caste based speakers on their vehicle. So all these are, some of the characteristics of globalization and increasing personal freedoms and changing their relationships with the families. So as I have already emphasized, that there has been a persistent decline in the joint family system in India because of the globalization, and there has been there has been a dominance of nuclear families. So joint family system has decreased and nuclear families have increased, and modern thoughts like live-in relationships or live-in culture have also been recognized or seen in the famous Kannimal case as well. So all these things can be associated with the globalization. So ultimately you have to write a proper conclusion for this answer. In conclusion, globalization has political, economic and cultural expressions, so all of which must be recognized. So these cultural expressions, or every encompassing expressions of the globalization, have to be identified and recognized. The critical component of the global interconnectedness that is produced and maintained as a result of such ongoing movement. So ultimately the concern is that how globalization should be made a more and more a humane globalization, a responsible globalization, and how we transform globalization that could address the issues, or that could make women empowered, and at the same time everyone know their responsibilities, everyone enjoy the freedoms which are healthy in nature. So all these things have to be kept in mind when we are thinking about the globalization. And ultimately, so once culture is very very important, erosion of cultural values, erosion of traditions under the influence of modernity, under the influence of westernization, is not good for the society in the longer term. So that is what we need to think about. So globalization is important, but globalization has to be changed to fit the Indian context, and that is very important. So that's how you can conclude this answer. And so by those two questions we have finished the gender studies paper 1 analysis, and now we'll try to analyze gender studies paper 2 questions, because understand gender studies paper 2 is very dynamic in nature, right? So it is very very dynamic in nature, dynamic in the sense that you have to link the static aspects with the dynamic questions, right? So these questions are very often linked with the current affairs, and because of that reason this paper is very very dynamic, and you have to have a strong hold, a strong command over the current affairs, and that is very important for you to write a best answers in this area, right? So we'll understand this first question. So first question is about examine the need for electoral reforms as suggested by various committees with particular reference to the one nation and one election principles, or it is also known as simultaneous elections, right? Simultaneous elections. So remember, while we are doing the news analysis, so we have discussed this one nation one election principle number of times. So because in recent times it is in news, and the union government has also declared that the one nation one election or the simultaneous elections will be implemented as soon as possible. And in fact, one committee was appointed to look into the feasibility of conducting one nation one election, right? So the committee was chaired by the former president of India, so Ramnath Kovind committee, right? So Ramnath Kovind Committee on Simultaneous Elections. So first and foremost, we'll try to understand what are these simultaneous elections. Remember, I have already explained these simultaneous elections. So as of now, the general elections to Lok Sabha and state legislative assembly elections are held separately, right? So it is not possible to conduct elections for all state legislative assemblies at one single point of time, and because of that reason, so different state legislative assemblies have different terms and elections are held at a different periods of time. But simultaneous election or one nation one election is a principle where general elections to Lok Sabha and state legislative elections would be held at a one single period of time, and that is known as one nation one election, or that is also known as simultaneous elections. And in fact, there are number of benefits because of that particular reason. The union government has been thinking over the idea of the simultaneous elections. However, in India till 1967 simultaneous elections took place, but after 1967, because of the premature dissolution of the state legislative assemblies, so elections to the state legislative assemblies as well as the general elections to Lok Sabha held at different periods of time. So I hope you have understood the simultaneous elections concept. So in fact, the Election Commission of India is entrusted with conducting elections to Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha, right? So I hope you knew about this. Election Commission of India conduct elections to Lok Sabha, Rajya Sabha, President and Vice President, state legislative assemblies or state legislature, and state legislative council. So these elections would be conducted by the Election Commission of India. However, since independence, Election Commission of India as a constitutional organization has been working very well, and it is one of the successful organizations in India, or successful constitutional institutions in India. So however, even though in India elections are held successfully and India is also largest democracy, but there is a need for electoral reforms in conducting elections because of certain reasons. So what are those reasons? So if you look at those reasons, electoral expenditure is very high in Indian elections. So it is very important to make sure that Indian elections are free from the money power and muscle power. So therefore, in this context, the election expenditure has to be reduced, and criminalization of politics has to be curtailed, and there is a need to increase a social representation or representation from different castes, representation from different religions. So that is very important in order to ensure that the political party democracy or inner party democracy is very, very important. And there is also a need to reform the anti-defection law, because anti-defection law has been curtailing the personal freedom of individual parliamentarians and individual members of legislative assemblies. And there is also a need to reform the electoral process, eligibility criteria, so everything. So therefore, electoral reforms have emphasized different committees. For example, Dinesh Goswami Committee, National Commission to Review Working of the Constitution, Law Commission. So all these commissions have been recommending various electoral reforms, right, since 1980s, 1990s. So examine the need for electoral reforms. What is the need for electoral reforms? As it was already suggested by various committees in reference to one nation, one election principle. Now, what should be the approach for this question? So, in the approach of the question, first and foremost, you briefly answer by mentioning about one nation, one election, and then discuss the need for electoral reforms as suggested by various committees. What is the need for electoral reforms? And then examine the need for electoral reforms as suggested by various committees, and then conclude the answer by suggesting an appropriate way forward. So that's how you could have a proper framework, a proper structure. So initially you just define what constitutes one nation, one election. So one nation, one election or simultaneous elections is a proposal that seeks to synchronize national and state elections in India. So they aimed to synchronize national and state elections in India. They aim to conduct the general elections of Lok Sabha and state legislative assemblies at one single go, aiming to streamline the electoral process. So initially, the one nation, one election is perceived as a grand solution without a clear problem. And in fact, it has sparked the debate over a potential impact on the democracy and governance as well. So that's how you could briefly describe the one nation, one election or simultaneous elections. And then you need to discuss the need for electoral reforms as suggested by various committees. Now, what is the need for electoral reforms? Why we need electoral reforms in this context? Now, Indian Constitution has provided for the Election Commission of India to conduct free and fair elections as part of Article 324 of the Indian Constitution. So, electoral reforms are necessary. Electoral reforms are important, and they aim to address issues of electoral malpractices and also ensure that elections are conducted in free and fair manner. So remember, free and fair elections in India are part of the basic structure doctrine of the basic structure doctrine of the judiciary, which aims to protect the Indian Constitution. So therefore, Constitution has established the Election Commission of India under Article 324 to ensure or to conduct free and fair elections, and also make sure that the Election Commission to address the electoral malpractices and also reduce the influence of money power and muzzle power. And in fact, it is very important that the voter turnout, a number of people, a number of eligible voters who cast their votes should be increased, and electoral reforms specifically aim or increase voter turnout and to address voter apathy and even difficulty in addressing or accessing the polling booths as well. So electoral reforms also help reduce the influence of money and muzzle power by regulating campaign finance and also ensuring the safety of the voters as well. So electoral reforms initiate measures such as mandatory disclosure of criminal records by the candidates and use of technology to monitor the electoral process, and that would prevent the electoral malpractices which have been taking place along with the electoral malpractices. So it would also clean the politics from criminalization of the politics. Right, so criminalization of politics is one of the major problem that the Indian democracy or Indian electoral system has been facing. So we must cleanse the political system or the elections from the criminals entering into the politics. And electoral reforms try to bring down the inequalities such as underrepresentation of women and marginalized communities. So all these points we have discussed, and because of that reason electoral reforms are very important and electoral reforms are necessary. And then you need to write examine the need for electoral reforms as it was suggested by various committees in the context of one nation, one election. Right, so remember that there were number of committees which were earlier appointed to look into the elections, or they have also come up with various suggestions to conduct free and fair elections. So one very important committee was Dinesh Goswami committee, and this Dinesh Goswami committee on electoral reforms has submitted its report in 1990, and this Dinesh Goswami committee has recommended that there is a need to curb the influence of money power, and there is also a need to ensure transparency in the electoral roll process considering the state funding of the elections. So Dinesh Goswami committee was the committee which has recommended the state funding of elections. And even Law Commission in the year 2015 has proposed ban on paid news and addressing the issue of criminalization of politics, which is one of the most concerning and most serious issue that Indian electoral system has been facing. And Law Commission has also recommended revisiting the anti-defection law to ensure political stability. And even Election Commission of India in the year 2022 has suggested certain reforms in the transparency of electoral bonds, and in fact the Supreme Court itself have declared the electoral bonds as unconstitutional because they violate the voters' right to know about the voters' right to information. And stringent laws to counter misuse of social media by different parties, and also introduction of remote voting for the migrant voters. Now all these things are part of the one nation or one election or different committees which have recommended these reforms, right? So what is this one nation one election? As I've already told you that it is a synchronization of general elections to the Lok Sabha and state legislative assemblies, and in fact as I've already told you that it is a norm, and in fact one nation one elections actually held until 1961, and simultaneous elections were conducted to Lok Sabha and state legislative assemblies in the year 1952, 1957, 1962 and 1967 as well. So however, due to premature dissolution of some legislative assemblies in 1968, 1969, simultaneous election cycle has got disrupted. And even continuous election cycles are a financial burden on the state exchequer, right? So this ultimately the expenditure to conduct elections falls upon the state exchequer, so therefore it would be a burden on the part of the state when there would be a regular election. So therefore continuous election cycles are a financial burden on the state exchequer. One nation one election will reduce the overall expenditure on the political process by the Election Commission of India, and in fact simultaneous elections will also reduce campaign expenditure of the political parties and candidates, and this would also help the smaller parties to better manage their existing financial resources. This would be another advantage of conducting simultaneous elections. And with the conducting elections different parts of India at different points of time, the model code of conduct would be regularly enforced or imposed. With the imposition of the model code of conduct during the polls, that actually stalls the developmental work for months at a time, and it will reduce the policy paralysis, and that results from imposition of model code of conduct during the election time. And even there would be a frequent deployment of the forces during the elections, and that would lead to the compromising national security. And when we conduct the simultaneous elections or one nation one elections, so there is no need to regularly deploy the security forces for the electoral purposes, and that ensures or that results in better management of the security forces and also protecting national security and also dealing with problems such as Naxalism as well. However, there are a lot of challenges when it comes to conducting simultaneous elections. Those challenges have to be addressed in a consensus based mechanism, bringing in all stakeholders, state governments, union government, political parties, and there should be a consensus to conduct simultaneous elections in India. So next question, it is about the the alternative dispute resolution mechanisms. Lok Adalat and arbitration tribunals both are alternative dispute resolution mechanisms. The question is, explain and distinguish between Lok Adalats and arbitration tribunals. whether they entertain civil and criminal cases. So this is 150 word answer. So remember that both arbitration tribunals and lok adalats are alternative dispute resolution mechanisms, and they aim at reducing the burden on the judiciary in terms of, pending cases is a problem in Supreme Court and High Courts or in the judiciary. So the alternative dispute resolution mechanisms amicably settle the disputes, and that would ensure speedy justice, and that would also reduces the burden or the pendency of cases in the formal judiciary. So these are the different types of alternative dispute resolution mechanisms, right? So the approach and the structuring of this answer is very important. When it comes to the approach, first and foremost you have to introduce the answer with lok adalats and arbitration tribunals, and then you have to explain and then distinguish both lok adalats and arbitration tribunals, and explain whether lok adalats and arbitration tribunals entertain civil and criminal cases, and conclude the answer by emphasizing on their importance. So how these alternative dispute resolution mechanisms are important. So in the introduction you briefly introduce about the lok adalat. So lok adalat is an alternative dispute resolution mechanism, and through lok adalat and the tribunals, arbitration tribunals, they are actually a mechanism to arrive at an amicable settlement of disputes outside of court. Lok adalats and arbitration tribunals are alternative dispute resolution mechanisms in India, and they aim at reducing the burden of formal courts and providing speedy justice as well. And then you have to distinguish between lok adalats and arbitration tribunals. There are certain differences between lok adalats and arbitration tribunals. So lok adalats are established under National Legal Services Authorities Act, which was passed by the Union Parliament in the year 1987. But on the other hand, arbitration tribunals are being established, or they are governed by the Arbitration and Conciliation Act of 1996. And lok adalats are composed of sitting or retired judicial officer and two other members, usually a lawyer and social worker. So this is how lok adalats at the local levels are being composed of. However, on the other hand, arbitration tribunals consist of one or more arbitrators chosen by the different parties. And lok adalats handle both civil as well as criminal cases and even compoundable offences. So compoundable offences means offences which can be compromised. A compromise can be achieved. Offences where settlement is possible. So they are known as compoundable offences. However, arbitration tribunals deal primarily with civil disputes. They cannot handle the criminal disputes. Remember, this is very important. You may also get a prelims based question from these differences. And lok adalats decisions are binding and they are non-appealable. So right, you cannot appeal against the decision of a lok adalat once lok adalat gives its judgment. But on the other hand, awards can be challenged in court under specific circumstances in case of arbitration tribunals. And in fact, lok adalats follow a conciliatory approach focusing on compromise. But on the other hand, arbitration tribunals follow more formal and court-like procedures. So these are the basic differences between lok adalats and arbitration tribunals. Now apart from that, so you can also, if you want, you can also go the comparison and differences between lok adalats and arbitration tribunals. So lok adalats informal and less rigid procedure, but arbitration tribunals a formal procedure and structured legal framework exists, and the decisions in lok adalats are being taken based on consensus and negotiation. Arbitration tribunals the decisions are based on legal principles and existing evidence, and lok adalats the authority is non-judicial and in fact presided over by judge and legal expert and social worker, and judicial authority to make binding decisions. They are arbitration tribunals, and in fact they deal with primary and compoundable criminal offences as well. But arbitration tribunals, as we have already discussed, they primarily deal with civil disputes including commercial and contractual issues, and decisions are not legally binding but enforceable once accepted by the people or the parties, and decisions are legally binding and enforceable in courts. And cost, so they are generally lower cost effective and quick. They also provide speedy justice. But on the other hand, arbitration tribunals can be costly and lengthy depending on complexity of these cases as well. And we have discussed these aspects also. When it comes to lok adalats, lok adalats can entertain civil cases such as property disputes, family disputes, land disputes. So all these disputes can be heard by the lok adalats, and lok adalats can also take up the criminal cases, but those criminal cases can only be compoundable offenses. Compoundable offenses means minor offenses where parties can arrive at a settlement and they can settle these issues. And then arbitration tribunals, so they can only deal with the civil cases. Typically commercial disputes, they can be addressed, and no jurisdiction, they have no jurisdiction over the criminal matters. Lok adalats focus on community based mediation and conciliation. Arbitration tribunals provide a formal and private forum for resolving disputes through arbitration. So both mechanisms offer advantages in terms of speed, cost effectiveness, flexibility, and making popular choices for parties seeking timely and efficient resolution of the disputes. And ultimately, both lok adalats and other alternative dispute resolution mechanisms ensure that a speedy justice would be served, the burden on the judiciary would be reduced, and also a compromise can be achieved. And in fact, they are more and more cost effective, or they cost less, and they also take a lesser time. So the issues or the disputes can be settled in a quicker time, right? So that's all in this lecture, and thank you so much. If you like our work,